A Stoic doesn't have to stuff their emotions down. The idea is that you don't let those emotions overwhelm your life or override your ability to make rational decisions. People think they know Marcus Aurelius, and we can imagine even in ancient Rome, where he's the emperor, the most powerful, important man in the world. They had statues of him. He was seen and worshipped by crowds. I think one of the beautiful, fascinating things about this figure who lived, nearly 2,000 years ago is that for all that we do know about him, he's been immensely studied. His private thoughts come to us in the form of meditations. Despite 2,000 years of fascination, of contemporary fame as well, he's still giving up his secret. I'm Ryan Holiday, and not only have I've written a number of books about Stoic philosophy, but I've been lucky enough to speak about Marcus Aurelius and the Stoics to the NBA, the NFL, sitting senators, special forces leaders. But I've been now on a 15-year journey to understand Marcus Aurelius. Since I first read him in my college apartment as a 19-year-old, to reading him a little bit even this morning, he's always showing me something new. And so in today's episode, I want to talk about that. The things that you don't know about Marcus Aurelius, but certainly should, on a level that helps us understand ourselves a little bit better too. The first thing to understand about Marcus is that he lived through a plague. People sort of vaguely understood that the Antonine Plague happens in Marcus Aurelius' time. That's why it's called the Antonine Plague. But I think it's only going through the COVID-19 pandemic over the last couple of years that helps one understand the way that an event like that would have shaped Marcus. One of my favorite quotes from Marcus, he says, there are two types of plagues. There's the one that destroys your life, and the one that destroys your character. Quote holds true. There are people who maybe they didn't get COVID, but they caught something much worse. Conspiratorial thinking, cruelty, indifference to other people. But Marcus's life is shaped by the plague. It's also an opportunity, a crisis for him to respond to as a leader. Actually, one of the things he learns from his stepfather, Antoninus, was to listen to experts. And this is why Marcus puts Galen, the great medical mind of his time, in charge of the pandemic response. But also the exercise of memento mori for the Stoics, the idea that life is short, that you could go at any moment. This is something Marcus would have experienced firsthand. He witnessed death all around him. Constantly, millions of Romans died in this horrendous plague. And ultimately, we think even Marcus Aurelius died of it. And his last words are a reminder to his friends who were crying over his deathbed, not to think of him, this singular individual, but all of the people who died of the plague and all of the people who would eventually die, including potentially his friends themselves. We have this image, of course, of the Stoic as the emotionless robot. So you might be surprised to learn that Marcus Aurelius was a little bit of a crier. Several of the stories that we have about Marcus, and we don't have many, involve him crying. He cried when he lost one of his favorite tutors. He even cried, it was said, openly in court one day when a pleading attorney mentions the immense death toll of those lost in the Antonine Plague. But Marcus was a crier, and life demanded, I think, tears from him. In some cases, he lost multiple children. He outlived his wife. He was betrayed by a close friend. A Stoic doesn't have to stuff their emotions down. The idea is that you don't let those emotions overwhelm your life or override your ability to make rational decisions. But you have to be kind to yourself, and you have to let yourself feel things. You might not know that Marcus had a little nickname. His nickname was Verissimus. And this comes from the Emperor Hadrian, who notices the potential in this young boy and decides to set him up and train him to be his eventual successor. But he calls him this nickname. It's a play on the word truth or truthfulness. Marcus was the most truthful. Even as a young boy, he was surprisingly and refreshingly honest. And perhaps that's what made Hadrian select him to one day be king. Marcus was a bit of a crier, but he was not a good sleeper. And in fact, if you read Meditations multiple times, he talks about struggling to get out of bed in the morning. This isn't just because he's like us and getting out of bed in the morning is difficult. It's because he had trouble sleeping. He was not a good sleeper. He was a chronic insomniac. And I think that actually makes his drive to get up early in the morning to meet the day, to do his job, it makes it more impressive. He didn't have an easy time of it, but ultimately this insomnia is a thread running through Marcus's life. One chronicler of Meditations notes that it was in the midnight dimness that Marcus made his great contribution to philosophy, that he wrote his Meditations. Marcus had a sense of humor. Again, the stereotype of the Stoic being joyless, emotionless, it's wrong. In one of his letters to his tutor Fronto, he talks about this prank he played on a shepherd. But one of my favorite examples of Marcus Aurelius' humor is he jokes in Meditations about a man so rich he had nowhere to shit in his house. His house was so filled with stuff that he didn't have any room, and Marcus was mocking him. But I like the idea that this dour and serious Stoic still had room in his life for literal toilet humor. I mentioned earlier that Marcus had things to be upset about in life, and he did. And one of those was the betrayal of him by his best friend, his most trusted general, Avidius Cassius, who declared himself emperor. And this put Marcus in a serious bind. Obviously, you can't allow, as king, someone else to declare themselves king. And Marcus had to find a way to respond. And he did it in typical Stoic fashion. He said, it's an opportunity to treat someone well who has not treated me well. And he says, ultimately, to teach Rome how to respond to civil strife. And that's what he does to the best of his ability. Ultimately, Cassius himself is betrayed, which is what happens when you do terrible things. He himself is betrayed and assassinated. And we're told that Marcus wept, again, having lost the opportunity to forgive and be merciful to his friend. In Meditations, Marcus Aurelius says life is warfare and a journey far from home. And again, it's important to understand that parts of Meditations are literal. And in this case, Marcus is referring to the decade plus that he spends on the road. His predecessor Antoninus almost never leaves Rome. Marcus has to spend 12 years touring the empire, not for sightseeing, but touring the empire because he was at war. There's a famous story of Marcus returning one day to Rome, and a cheering crowd greets him, and they remind him that he's been gone almost 8 years. Marcus has to put up with a lot with his life, but he would have loved to spend time with his philosophy books, with his family, with his friends, in his beautiful palace. But life had other plans. I think the most remarkable thing about Marcus that people don't know, first off, that his father was not emperor. Marcus is chosen to be emperor. Hadrian selects Marcus, but realizes that Marcus is too young, so he chooses a placeholder to train Marcus for the throne, Antoninus Pius. And so Marcus is groomed for power. He trains for it. It's not this thing he gets by birthright, but there's a complication, which is that one of Hadrian's earlier potential predecessors had a son. And this son potentially thought that he was entitled to the throne, or other people thought he was entitled to the throne. So Marcus ascends to the throne. He's clearly the most qualified, the most trained, the most desired, and he has this potential rival. And we know historically what kings do to these rivals. They kill them. But Marcus does the exact opposite. The first thing that Marcus does with absolute power is name his stepbrother, someone he has no relation to whatsoever. He names him co-emperor. Can you believe that? The first thing he does with absolute power is give half of it away. And they rule effectively together as a team. I imagine Marcus going, look, it is a tough job. There's more than enough responsibility to go around. I'm gonna share it. Marcus Aurelius lost 8 children before they reached adulthood. No parent should have to bury a child, as they say. Marcus Aurelius buried 8. And somehow this didn't break him. Somehow this didn't destroy him. How is that? But I do think there's one interesting Stoic exercise that Marcus Aurelius learned from Epictetus that perhaps helped with this. Epictetus said that as you tuck your child in at night, you should say to yourself, they might not make it until the morning. And the idea wasn't, oh, my children are gonna die, I should detach myself, I should write it off. I think the idea is that while you have your children, be present for them. Don't rush through bedtime. Be there for them. Soak them in, don't take them for granted. And so we can imagine it being some solace, not enough, but some solace, that as Marcus dealt with that horrible loss, he could at least comfort himself that while he had them, he was there and present for them as best he could. Marcus may have had all of the trappings of success and power, but he didn't care about them. He said famously to the Senate that all of this is yours. I don't even own this house. But the truth is, even from an early age, Marcus slept on a hard mattress. He preferred the country life. He was a humble man. He lived a simple life. When his mother died and left him a lot of money, he gave it to his sister. He was tried to be generous. He didn't need much, and that made him a greater man. Marcus is, of course, famously associated with Stoic philosophy. He's considered the Stoic emperor, but Gregory Hayes, one of his great biographers and translators, is my favorite edition. Hayes points out that nowhere does Marcus explicitly identify with the Stoic. He, of course, quotes the Stoics. He, of course, says things that the Stoics said, but he suspects that Marcus would have been more of a generalist, that Marcus would have actually identified as a philosopher. What Marcus loved was philosophy and wisdom and anything that could help him get closer to the good life, to truth, to justice, to wisdom, to courage. But Marcus identified instead more as a philosopher than a specific school. I mentioned Marcus's kids. I think his wife, Faustina, is worth pointing out as maybe something you didn't know about her. He was married for decades, but he seems to have actually loved his wife. I think this is partly illustrated by all the children they had together, that he was a man, a human with human urges, but that he seems to have genuinely loved and supported his wife. Even when people claimed she was unfaithful or tried to spread rumors about her, he accepted her and loved her and put it all out of his mind. Most marriages for professional politicians are not good ones, but Marcus's seems to have been great. You might not think of Marcus as a guy who doubted himself, who had what we now call imposter syndrome, but in fact he did. We're told that when Marcus was informed he would one day be the emperor, he broke down, again in tears. He doubted whether he had what it took. He thought of all the bad kings in history, all the terrible things that they'd done, and he wondered if he could escape that, if he could still be a good person and be a king. So this is him doubting himself. He questioned whether he could do it, which I think is good. If you think, of course I can do it, I'm great, everything I do turns to gold, I don't think that's the right attitude. It's good to question yourself. It's good to have doubts. But then the day before he ascends to the purple, as they say, Marcus has a dream. And in this dream, he has shoulders of ivory. And this reminds him, he's stronger than he thought. He's strong enough to bear this. His shoulders can bear the load. And I love this image, the image of the ivory shoulders. You too are stronger than you know. We're stronger than we know. And that's what Marcus realized, and that's what helped him get over his imposter syndrome. Marcus has what might be the most magnanimous and impressive garage sale in history. In the depths of the plague, as Rome's treasury is depleted, as the economy is falling apart because of the devastation of the Black Death, Marcus holds a garage sale. He walks through the imperial palace and he marks goblets and jewels and robes and couches. He and his wife's most valuable possessions he sells on the lawn of the palace. Not to raise money for himself, but to raise money for Rome. He doesn't care about the trappings. Remember, we talked about the simple life. Marcus's love of the simple life allowed him in this great moment to demonstrate an example of selfless leadership, of eating last, of putting others first. And I think it's one of the great moments of his life. We tend to think of philosophers as bookish, but Marcus was a nerd and a jock. He fought, he wrestled, he rode horses. He hunted, even with Hadrian. He was a man's man in that sense, but he was also a lover of wisdom and a lover of poetry and plays. We see this in Meditations. And I think it's a reminder, you don't have to be one or the other. You can be anything you want to be. Just be yourself. Follow the interest that you have. There's a great expression though, mens sano in corpore sano. Basically, strong mind in a strong body. And I think that's what Marcus was. Marcus was someone who never stopped learning. There's a great story about Marcus towards the end of his life. He's an old man. One of the rare moments that he's there in Rome, he's leaving the palace carrying some books with him, and a man says, "Marcus, where are you going?" And Marcus says, "I'm off to see Sextus the philosopher, to learn that which I do not yet know." And the man marveled how amazing it is that the emperor, the most powerful man in the world, is still taking up his tablets and going to school. And that's how you have to think about education. Marcus's life is changed by a single book, in the same way that my life was changed by someone recommending Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus to me. Junius Rusticus, this is Marcus Aurelius' philosophy teacher, hands him a copy of Meditations. And he thanks Rusticus in Meditations for introducing him to Epictetus' lecture. He said, for loaning me his own copy. I just love the idea that all of history is shaped by this chance book recommendation. But it's not just the recommendation, right? I'm sure lots of people recommend lots of books. Epictetus has been recommended by lots of people. It's that Marcus followed it up. He read the book, and then most importantly, he applied it. Marcus's own book, Meditation, he was writing it to himself. He had no idea this would be published, that we would be talking about it today. He might well be mortified, right? This isn't a work of published performative philosophy. It's the private notes of the most powerful man in the world. Although Marcus was Roman and the Romans spoke Latin, he wrote to himself in Greek because it's a more beautiful language, because Greek was the language of the philosophers. And again, it's just a remarkable achievement that even a single passage in this book is intelligible or usable or universal as it is, because he wasn't thinking about you at all. When Marcus says, you do this, you should do this, you need to stop doing this, he's not really talking to you, talking to himself, but he's doing it so specifically and earnestly and authentically that it has impact and resonance with all of us all these years later. The last thing you should know about Marcus is how he departed from this world. Marcus supposedly spends the last minutes of his life telling his friends, why are you weeping for me? Think about the plague, he said. Think about the people it's claimed. Think about your own fragility and mortality. That, we understand, was said in the last moments of his life. But even the last pages of Meditations point at this as well. He says, you've lived your life as a great citizen in a great city, 500 years or 100, what's the difference? The laws make no distinction. And he says, now you're being sent away. Why is that so terrible? He said, like the curtain coming down on an actor, but I've only gotten through 3 acts. He says, yes, this is a drama in 3 acts, a length fixed by the power that created you and now directs your dissolution. Neither was yours to determine. And then these are the last words that he publishes, and they're worth remembering and carrying with us today. Those are just some things that you probably didn't know about Marcus that I've benefited so much from learning over the years, and I continue my study of him. I've read this book now 100 times. I've read biographies of Marcus. I've studied him 1,000 ways from 1,000 angles. And we have some other good videos, which we'll link to, where you can figure out how to read Marcus Aurelius and other things you should know about him. But I wanted to leave you those unexpected facts about Marcus Aurelius, and I hope they leave you something to chew on. If you want to learn more about Stoic philosophy, totally for free, you can sign up for a daily Stoic email. It's 1 free email every morning, the best of Stoic wisdom, dailystoic.com/email.